Hello and welcome everybody to today's Zoom session, Critical Race Theory. What is critical race theory and why do people want to stop it? What's wrong about the truth and why is it so divisive? Why is institutionalized racism so deeply rooted in the United States? And where do reparations fit into all of this? These and many, many more questions will be discussed during today's collaborative event between the Democrats Abroad Global Black Caucus, National Education Association, the Together is Better Alliance, and the Democrats Abroad Reparations Task Force. But before we kick off today's session, let me lay down some ground information. We're recording this session. If you do not agree with being filmed, please turn the camera off. Please keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking, and please type * hands up into the chat box so that we can cue people speaking, and please do not interrupt people mid-sentence while they are speaking. Democrats Abroad is a volunteer-driven organization. Help us register Americans all over the world for the 2022 midterm elections. The easiest way to make a contribution is to visit democratsabroad.org/BC-donations. And last but not least, I encourage each and every one of you to share the knowledge of this session with your family, friends, co-workers, or even a stranger on the park bench. And believe me, I do this quite often, and beautiful conversations always resolve out of that. My name is Leedonal, also known as Jasmine Moore, your Democrats Abroad Global Black Caucus Chair, Democrats Abroad Switzerland's DPCA voting rep, and I'm very honored being joined by Gina Harris from the National Education Association, the Black Caucus Treasurer, and Human and Civil Rights Committee Chair of the Illinois Education Association. Gina is an educator, peacemaker, and true architect of change. She serves as a state director for the National Education Association and on the school board in her town. Her expertise developing education professionals on racial justice in education and restorative practices has allowed her to work to empower educators and organizations around the country. Gina founded Unity Dialogues, a circle process where students and adults learn from each other and grow from authentic, open dialogues about race and unity development. As a restorative justice practitioner and trainer, Gina utilizes circle processes and communication tools to create environments that break down barriers to communication and encourages open, honest dialogue inside and outside of the classroom. Thank you, Gina, for joining us today. Sharon Hatchett, president of Together is Better Alliance. Sharon currently serves as the president of Together is Better Alliance, a nonprofit committed to dismantling systemic racism through education. Prior to her retirement, Ms. Hatchett practiced law for close to 30 years with a global automotive manufacturer based in Detroit, Michigan, where her legal practice was primarily focused on international legal matters. In doing so, she traveled extensively from Detroit and worked as an expat in Zurich, Switzerland, and Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Sharon also has a long history of volunteerism, including prior to her retirement. Currently, she serves on the League of American Orchestras Board of Directors, at the Advisory Board for Coaster Cycles, and the Council of Legal Advisors for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Sharon is also an active supporter of the Chicago Sinfonietta, a classical music orchestra formed in 1987 by Maestro Paul Freeman, a Black man committed to providing people of color access to a career path in the classical music field. And Sharon is also a very, very big supporter of Democrats Abroad. This is not the first time that we've worked closely together. So thank you, Sharon, for joining us today. Antar Antar is the chairperson of the Reparations Task Force and the Global Black Caucus Steering Committee Reparations Lead. Antar was born into a working-class family in the Bronx, New York. He gained first-hand knowledge of American political disenfranchisement. This consciousness was molded by his father, William Bill Keith, who was a poet, teacher, civil rights activist, ally of Malcolm X, and Black arts movement avant-garde artist. His father also was a two-time victim of predatory policing and mass incarceration. His story inspires a keen understanding that those in closest proximity to pain should be closest to power. As Global Black Caucus reparations lead, Antar's passion is advocacy for local, state, and federal reparations legislation. Central to the advocacy is the fight for HR 40, which would enact a commission to provide social, political, and economic analysis of trauma inflicted on Black America. and how to repair said damage, not isolated to slavery or Jim Crow. These traumas cycle into modern legal, educational, medical, socioeconomic, and political discrimination. He believes that street-level activism must work hand in hand with solid educational and legislative action to undo racial damage. Working in a multi-racial coalition, his ultimate goal is to educate, agitate, and organize for transformative and restorative justice in America through the act of reparations. Thank you, Antar, for joining us today as well. So why don't we just dive right into the topic of today, critical race theory. I'm going to hand over to Gina. Would you explain to us what is critical race theory and why is it so important that we have it?
Thank you. Thank you, Jazz. And it's so good to be with you all. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to just tell you what it's not and why it's important that we understand what it means to teach accurate history in our schools, because that is really what we've been focusing on at the National Education Association. What we've been talking about is the importance of teaching accurate history. And so I have a couple of slides that I'm going to share with you all just to take us through, because, well, I'm a teacher, so I can't help myself. There will always be a little bit of that in what I do. And so this idea of us teaching accurate history, and I found this great definition. Hold on one second while I get my screen together here. I found this great definition about CRT and what it is not, right? It's not a diversity and inclusion training. It's not about things that are being taught in classrooms. It's actually a practice, right? An academic practice of understanding the role of racism and how it shows up in our society, in all of the ways that it shows up in our society, and being able to look at it critically. So being able to evaluate, wow, so the housing that we're seeing, the way that our schools are disproportionately funded, all of that is happening because of racism, and there's a system that's involved with that. And so when I do these discussions in different spaces, I like to bring in this idea to help people understand that when we're talking about teaching accurate history, or when we're talking about racism specifically, we are not talking about interpersonal racism and not individualized racism. There are dimensions to racism and how it shows up in our society. And it's important for us to be really clear about that, because there's a misconception that, well, I'm not racist, so I'm not contributing to this system of, all of the activities that are transpiring. That's not me. No, we understand, right? It's not about individuals. It's about societal structures that are in place. And when we think about racism that's within institutions, like institutions of higher education, institutions of education, institutions of local governments. I sit on the school board in my town. And when we think about how it shows up in institutions, it has everything to do with the policies and procedures that there are. And then when we think about racism as it shows up in structurally, we can think about across those institutions. So if we were thinking about a student who is really interested in going to college, but attends a school that is underfunded, and then now how are they getting the funds that they might need just to have what they need in the classroom? Let's move them on to high school. Well, maybe they're not able to take the classes that they need to take in high school because they did not pass a standardized test that requires them to have a certain score. Now let's move them on to senior year in high school, and they're looking at colleges, junior and senior year. Well, colleges aren't accepting them because their test score into high school didn't get them into the courses that they need to take in high school. So now they didn't take those courses because the testing wouldn't allow them to. Now to be able to get into the university that they'd like to attend, they can't because they never took those courses that are required for certain universities, specifically universities that are considered the most advanced universities. So if you look at this system, right, if you look at structural racism and how it occurs for one student who may have a zip code that just does not allow them to have all of the advantages inside their elementary school, move them into middle school, move them into high school, then how does that impact their ability to go to university? So we are talking about an overall system. We are not talking about individualized racism between people. Not that we don't know that that occurs, it does occur. But when we're thinking about how does critical race theory impact what we're doing and how we as adults, it's not something that's being taught to children in schools. It just is not done that way. And currently I've taught everything in middle school except for math. And I worked in an elementary school as an English learner resource specialist. And now I'm a culture and climate coach. So I work across multiple buildings with educators, educating them in what this is, and as well as how do we make sure our spaces are inclusive, as well as socially, emotionally available for students. So when we're talking about this, we're wanting people to understand more fully, how is this system set up? And how do we evaluate it critically and historically so that we can take a broader look at what's happening and really give people an opportunity to understand now how we're seeing it show up in various places, including on the school board that I sit on, is we're seeing it show up as attacks on, well, please, we've passed laws now that you cannot teach critical race theory. Well, that's not what we were teaching. That's not what we were teaching. But okay, so how does this affect students in the classroom? How does this affect what we're able to do as educators? Well, the attacks are real. The attacks on school board members right now are very real, that they cannot have certain conversations. And if you have those conversations, you're getting threatened. There are I know people who have actually been threatened by their lives, that people are going to come to their house because they sit on a school board that has advocated for doing things that allow us to teach students accurate history. And in teaching accurate history, what we want to make sure that people know is that there's more than one perspective on history. And I'm not sure how many of you went to school and got one perspective on history, but most of the educational system is built to have one perspective. And it's typically been the white perspective. And we are hoping and working and wanting our students to be able to look at, wow, well, what might have been the perspective of the indigenous people on the continent of North America? What might have been the perspective of the enslaved people who were brought to this country, right? The enslaved Africans, what might be their perspective? And how do we ensure that our students are becoming better citizens to be in the world, to change these systems and policies that are in place so that they are the next generation to actually make those changes happen? So that's a little bit to start us off, Jazz. And I want to say also, I've got some tools for us to use based on the survey that we sent out, and I'll get to those a little bit later, but I hope that at least gets us started in the conversation.
Thank you very much, Gina. And we truly believe that the attacks are real, as you mentioned. And I think for you as an educator, dealing with that on an everyday basis, that must be quite overwhelming at times, I can imagine. So don't give up. Absolutely don't give up. I would like to go over to Sharon. Sharon, why do you think that there are people out there that want to stop it? What are they afraid of? And what's wrong about the truth? What do you think, Sharon? Your microphone is muted.
I fixed it now. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you for allowing me to speak to everyone today. It seems to me that fear is among some of the considerations as to why people do not want the truth known. You hear on one hand, some people are fearing that it will make students feel bad about the history of our country and some of what has happened. However, unless we get the fair and accurate history and truth out there, you run the problem of history repeating itself. And the other consideration that some of us ponder is whether, as we're watching the demographics of the country changing, I've had some people say to me that they are fearful that if people of color, whether it's African American, Native American, Asian, whatever the case may be, if the percentages grow over a period of years such that the dynamics shift, some have voiced a fear and concern that people may turn on them and treat them as poorly or as badly as people of color have been treated here. At one point, when I lived in South Africa, I've heard people also make a similar comment there that when apartheid was being ended, that there was such a fear. But to me, it's really not about fear, but unfortunately you have this misinformation being spread, the passage of legislation across the country in a way that is intended to block telling the true and accurate history. And it's really a dog whistle because, as Gina alluded to, you don't have K through 12 being taught critical race theory. It's something that came out of the legal community And if you look at articles, and being a retired lawyer myself, you understand that it's looking at these systems, factoring in the reality that racism, even if people are not intending to be racist and may not even be so, that the outcomes, whether it is in getting access to loans, funding, whatever the case may be, you're denied that. And some of that is historical in context, including some of the laws that have been passed relative to redlining, denying access to loans, et cetera. And so unless we have dialogues like this that we're having today, people will not understand those dynamics and how they're driving a lot of data points that are really not true. And we've got to make sure that true and accurate history is put out there to try to quiet the noise that is purely disinformation. And so, as representative of Together's Better Alliance, our focus is on how steps that can be taken to dismantle some of the systemic racism through education, and gatherings like this are very critical to that effort. So thank you for that, Lee.
Thank you, Sharon, as well. And also, while we're just speaking about sharing the knowledge, we also work closely together with the Long Shadow event, which really highlights in a very, very easy way of understanding where actually this institutionalized racism, where it actually comes from, how it is, how it was created, let's say it like that. And this is something that we spoke about with our membership as well, very much, and they love it. They love it and they get it and they understand it. So thank you very much for also always working closely together on that project as well. And I think because we have some colleagues in from South Africa, I think we could pull up an event for South Africa there pretty soon as well. Thank you, Sharon. Antar, while we're speaking of having institutionalized racism and why it's so rooted so deeply in the US, where do reparations fit into all of this?
Reparations would be the sum total, the final product of a national reckoning with history, a national reconciling with history, but before we can even reconcile with history, we have to actually, acknowledge it. And right now, that's where we are. We're just trying to get to the point where we can acknowledge this history. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to seamlessly transition to my PowerPoint presentation. All right, that worked more smoothly than I thought. Good. So what I want to say is this. I think, things have changed since our last discussion on CRT. When we last discussed CRT, it was one of numerous moral outrages that have been spat out by the right within, the last 50 years. It's changed its permutations numerous times, starting from the 60s, it was communism, the Red Scare. After 9/11, it was Muslim teachers coming in to indoctrinate students to teach them Sharia law. These days now, in the post-Floyd era, it's critical race theory. Each one of these moral outrages has a certain kind of fear at the heart of it. And I want to explore that because this fear is not subsiding, even though the understanding of CRT as a legal doctrine is starting to become more and more recognized by the right. They realize, okay, it's not an educational a Trojan horse, it's a legal system. However, many people on the right, many pundits on the right are now stipulating that the tenets brought on by study of this legal theory have the ability to indoctrinate and then have the ability to coerce teachers or compel teachers to re-indoctrinate students. So even though the understanding of CRT is starting to become more and more, I would say, solidified as a legal doctrine, the fear of this other is still there. And I want to tackle that fear. The CRT is the bud. I want to rip out the root. And that, I think, is always part of any real reparative justice. So, starting here, ideology, race, and the classroom, I want to talk about how, in American history, we've had different kind of mythos and different kind of national illusions that have really, been kind of militated to make the country more cohesive as a whole. And it's the fraying of these ideologies that causes what many people think is division, which is really just recognition. So some of you might be familiar with the lost cause ideology. I want to talk about how it influences classrooms today and how people are actually pushing back against that narrative. So let's dive in. Now, understanding the lost cause ideology. So, to make a long story short, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, his vice president took charge. This was Andrew Johnson, the 17th president of the United States of America. In order to quickly heal the divisions between North and South, he allowed Southern governors and legislatures to hold sway in their states. Abraham Lincoln wanted them to lose power and to be replaced by Union loyalists. Furthermore, he wanted federal troops to be there to ensure there were no racial hostilities from the defeated Confederates against their Black populations. Andrew Johnson reversed those injunctions. He pulled back the federal troops. He allowed the Southern governors to return, and he allowed them to create apparatus that would essentially enact an apologism that would pervade the South and eventually come to the North. The lost cause ideology is a system of reversing history. It's a system of occluding certain stories, changing the names of towns. That's easy and was done, but also changing history, revering certain war criminals as national historical figures deserving of love and affection and honor. Naming military bases after these racist psychopaths, and in essence, sanitizing the history of America to create a system where we have social institutions, religious institutions, educational institutions, and financial institutions affected by this ideology. Even today, we're at a situation where, depending on where you're educated in America, you will have two different, entirely different takes on the US Civil War. This is why in many places around the world, it's a popular kind of like quirky thing to say that America is the only country that lost its Civil War. Although the nation, the Union survived, the ideology of the fallen nation that was once extant still pervades the country and has a tremendous impact on the function of its institutions. And also, Andrew Johnson is notable for being the first president in United States history to pass reparations for former slaveholders, with the act that allowed basically those who gave up their property to be compensated for loss of it. So, this is one of the worst excuses for a human being in office. But, he actually set off a chain reaction to produce more of his ilk. Here we have a postcard that was popular at the time following the Civil War. Now, what you see here is a Confederate flag. This Confederate flag was actually made by school children painting their faces on a day off from school in front of a statue of Robert E. Lee. It's the human Confederate flag. Now, this was a postcard that was extremely popular throughout the South, extremely popular in the post-Civil War era. It wasn't just popular in the South, though. It also made its way up north, and it became extremely popular up north, again, showing how the fluctuations of supply and demand and commercialization of an ideology can soften some of the resistance to it, even getting people to co-opt this kind of purview. Let's go further. So a bad idea is hard to kill. The influence of the lost cause ideology is felt in the educational sector today. Hold on. Florida, Texas, and California, for instance, are the states with the highest proportion of school districts. As a result, the biggest school textbook providers, such as Pearson and Macmillan, they devise their text not on a particular state or a particular district, but on supply and demand, the biggest consumers. Because Florida, Texas, and California are the biggest consumers of textbooks, the textbook manufacturers create textbook histories that do not offend the sensibilities of the majority of the school boards in these states. So California is one thing, but Florida and Texas, in order to sell textbooks to schools in these districts and not offend the school boards, a certain kind of apologism is necessary. A certain kind of sanitizing is necessary, not only of the infractions and the war crimes of the Confederate South, but also of international white supremacy. For instance, in Florida and Texas, there needs to be specific care taken to address the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. When it comes to World War II, these textbooks, the majority of them, will detail Germany as the primary offender of international anti-Semitism. Sanitized from these books are the overt anti-Semitic violence within France, the overt anti-Semitic violence in Spain, the overt anti-Semitic violence in Great Britain. Now, there are many different theories as to why this is. The strongest theory is that there is an idea of essentially, maintaining the honor, the respect of the old world, where people who primarily, when the first European colonists came from the old world to the new world, there's a certain kind of maintenance of the pristineness of their history and also the pristineness of their history back home. So you will not learn much about Spanish anti-Semitism or French anti-Semitism when you read these books, but you will learn a lot about German anti-Semitism. You will learn a lot about the daughters of the Confederacy in an attempt to humanize the Confederacy. Again, elected school boards wield tremendous power. These are democratic organizations, but at the end of the day, they call the shots, and the textbook manufacturers bend to their will. They do, and the history shows it. So now, cognitive dissonance or dissidence. Just to reiterate, history taught as of today is inadequate in describing American racism. An ahistorical take has permeated American consciousness for generations, and learning unbiased US history is now seen as a radical departure from the norm. Now, I'm not trying to cast, a unifying slime or pall over the Republican Party, but I do have a Republican bigot of the day here. Now, this was an article taken from, a popular news source, Occupy Democrats, at the beginning of the CRT debacle. This is somebody from a school board. She's also a Republican campaign manager for local school boards in Connecticut. And she detailed her opposition to teaching kids about the impact of racism in America because, quote unquote, helping kids of color to feel they belong has a negative effect on white, Christian, or conservative kids. Now, I know this is appalling. I know this is disgusting, but I really think we need to identify, break down where this comes from, break down the ideological nature of this. There is a certain kind of cause and effect here that's creating this. She was fine before we started talking about the truth, before we started talking about what's happening to us. We need to understand this mentality, because this mentality is starting to pervade the Republican Party, and they're starting to use history, the teaching of history, as a weapon against progressive politics, Democrats in general, but any person who supports a progressive take on racial and economic justice. We need to fight this threat head on. Take a look at this picture now. Just take a look. What do you see here? This is an image from a detailed image popularly, done in like the 17 or 1800s of what would have been the first Thanksgiving. From, of course, a Eurocentric WASP perspective that seeks to demoralize and diminish indigenous life. You see there's a guy here who has his back kind of turned, looking somewhat skeptically at the people. You almost forget that it was the indigenous people who helped the pilgrims and not the other way around. Let's go a little bit further. What do you see here? Another photo. Again, the maintenance of this narrative is being instilled and distilled down through the ages. We see Native Americans here seated on the floor. They're not able to be sitting at the table, and they have to eat from somebody handing food to them, because of course, according to this artist and the ideology within this artist's mind, they do not have the means to fend for themselves, the Native Americans. And we see here another image. We see a persistence in this narrative. It doesn't stop here. We see a persistence of this narrative today in the veneration of Teddy Roosevelt with on a horse, on a statue in New York City. And the statue, I think, is going to be removed, by the way. We have on his right a Native American man, an indigenous man, on his left, a Black slave. Both are walking on foot, and they have this honorable man standing before him, honorable. We see that we cannot just label an ideology created by Andrew Johnson as primary culprit here. There's something deeper than the lost cause ideology. It's deeper than just mere history. It's something baked deep, deep, deep into the root and fabric of the cultural genesis of this country. We put these men on statues. We put these men on rock faces, defiling Native American religious and spiritual grounds, hallowed grounds, using it instead to prop up so-called great men. And when we do this, we leave the door open for other people who have a similar understanding of the world to also envision where they can go. Do you see how now this is not just rooted in the lost cause, but it's something deeper in the fabric of the nation, and we do need to tackle that. So before I do that, I want to just say this. Every modern nation state has its own national mythos, such as France, Germany, Japan, and America. These nations create this mythos to ensure that its majority population feels a sense of pride, prestige, and comfort in its founding, its founders, and its traditions. America is not necessarily unique in this regard. What sets America apart from other nations is the differences of its many minority citizens and the perspectives. One thing that's usually unique about being a minority in a majority white country is the level of personal recognition of at least some of the ugly realities behind the myths that undermine them. Yet many minorities have learned to love their nation despite these ugly truths that we hold self-evident. As minorities, we've learned to hold parallel, often incongruous ideas in mind at the same time, and we don't go insane. Black Americans in particular are accustomed to living and loving within the precariousness of parallel lives. The brushing up of national mythos against our reality can and has compelled many Black Americans throughout US history to want to do something to change or push the nation to fulfill its ideals. Nationalists, however, live in the luxury of not having to live in parallel worlds. They aren't comfortable with national cognitive dissonance. They've been educated and fed on only one story, tailored to one perspective their entire lives. These largely white conservative Americans have grown to identify heavily with the myth and the feelings they engender. Thus, to threaten, attack, or obliterate this myth to them is felt as an insult and expression of hatred or violence against America. Over time, this sense has devolved into a certain American exceptionalism, where in the eyes of nationalists, they are the only legitimate members of society. In the rawest human sense, this can be seen as a very primal and reflexive reaction. In the world of pain and the feelings it produces, when the myth is challenged, it can even make sense. Change feels like an attack on a sinister agenda because they aren't aware or don't care that the mythology is a fabrication meant to conceal or downplay unflattering realities. Again, reactions like the ones we have been seeing about CRT from conservatives can on a primal level make sense because this myth, through careful curation, has created a comfortable and unifying sense among our nation's majority. But this myth was created for this very purpose, to homogenize disparate peoples largely identifying as white, and as such became an integral part of the US education ecosystem and media. The problem comes when we need to move the nation forward, as the myths are holding us back now, democracy back, and our survival back as a nation and a people. We need to not only tackle vestiges of the lost cause, but also aspects of national myth that are being used as a weapon against progressive legislation and advocacy. So now, finally, what are some Americans opposed? Why are some Americans opposed to this history? I have some contextual questions here. What are the positives and benefits of learning an unbiased US history? What effects would this have on white students in the classroom? And how would understanding this history affect perceptions of societal problems in America? Thank you. Stop sharing now.
Great, thank you, Antar, very, very much for the deep insight. And as I also was able to see that in the chat box, there already were a few comments and head shaking going on. Bruce, I see you in the chat there. What we're going to do now, Bruce, if you may like to hold your question there, we're actually going to enter breakout rooms first. And then after the breakout rooms, we're set up for Q&As. Great. So again, thank you all very much for participating in the little homework assignment that we sent out. And before we go out into these breakout rooms, Gina, why is such a checklist that we actually did with the forms? Why is that so important sometimes?
Thank you, Jazz, and thank you, everyone. I feel compelled to point out that although I sit on the board for the National Education, our association is a bipartisan party. I just have to say that. Personally, I am a Democrat, but I'm not representative of our entire board. So I felt compelled to say that in this space. But let me just explain why we wanted you to fill out the questionnaire that came from the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. Those questions are questions that if you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, these are the kinds of concerns or day-to-day attacks that we live with that white people don't typically have to experience or think about in any way, shape, or form. And so in order for us to get deeper into a conversation together today, and that's why we're breaking out into breakout rooms, is really for us to seek more understanding, for us to really get to a space with each other that this is actually how it's showing up. This is what it looks like. Because there are a lot of conversations happening right now about white privilege and what white privilege means, what it is, and how it does not pertain to me. I've had a number of people say, it does not pertain to me. I'm not sure why we have to discuss this. Because there are some undercurrents, as Antar was mentioning, that are already built into our system. And this survey that we sent you all actually delineates some of what that is. So when we break out into our rooms, we will talk about it a little bit. We're going to talk about what that survey was like, what we experienced. And I will just also add, because I do this type of work in a lot of spaces, I want to also add that If this is highly uncomfortable, then that is a good thing and we are doing it right. Because discomfort and emotions of defensiveness or anything that comes up absolutely is we're in the right space. Because if we're not, we don't typically have these conversations in this level of a productive way. So the way, considering that we are able to do that today, if you have any emotions come up, please just recognize that that's absolutely natural. And that's how we move through this and work and grow together. So yeah, did I kind of cover it there, Jess?
Perfect.
I will open up the rooms. And thank you, Marianne, for being here. I'll open up the room so that we can move into our small group discussions. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had productive conversations.
Absolutely, absolutely. This was really, really interesting and quite personal. Sharon, would you give us a short update on what you discussed or what you gathered in your session? And we'll walk through with all of our 4 rooms, and then we'll do some few more questions. Also, Bruce, I still have you in the queue there. So we're a bit over time already now, but I think if we add 15 minutes to everything, is that fine, Gina, for you? Okay, great. Sharon, would you tell us what you gathered in your breakout room?
All right, sorry about you being muted. We had a very good conversation. We had all women, but diverse in our breakout session. And you know, for example, when you talk about looking at the questions that made you think on the checklist, different fiscal responsibility and being questioned about whether you have an ability to pay your bills and things like that. We talked about that, and there were certainly some divergent views on that, where the participants who were white never thought that there would be a consideration about whether you can pay your bills, unlike when you're a person of color, it became a prevalent issue. The same is true. We had some conversation about, you know, the issue of critical race theory, for example, when you mention as a person of color to someone white in the audience who may be within the room, you start talking about issues of race, you may get some pushback, and much like what we talked about in our presentations, the initial response was, you're personally attacking me, and which was not the case. It was really about a recognition that racism does exist. And after some back and forth, the person who felt uncomfortable and didn't view it as a commentary, just high level that there is an issue of racism, did finally acknowledge that they should step back and hear her and acknowledge that they needed to do some self-reflection in order to grow and understand that those types of dynamics exist. Interestingly, we talked about in the business world, for example, how being late for a meeting, that the culture of one person's company was such that the general view was that in a majority white organization that if the people of color tended to always be late, and there was a strong feeling that that was commonplace, and there were views, stereotypes, I guess, and expectations that that might be the case. Quite on the other hand, we had someone indicate that a broad recognition that all white people do have privilege, and that in effect, the main issue is, gender, where you may have the issue of differing treatment because of the bias among white men versus women. There are some dynamics there at play that you need to be mindful of. And being a white woman, I know that there, with the call cut off, but I think was being said during the 80s when women were entering the corporate world, that I think the point was being made that there was a major advantage to white women when coming into that environment. And I was in corporate America in that same window, and know that there was a view that people of color who were making it, there was a perception that affirmative action may have gone into play there, and it wasn't about your skills and capability. And so there were still hurdles to overcome. So those are some of the highlights that we talked about, and just some recognition of there are dynamics at work. And I think the group was generally reflective on some of the comments being made as we were talking, and how those of color on the call had very different responses to some of the questions.
Great, thank you, Sharon, very much. Antar.
Hey, Jazz. Hey, yeah, thank you. Yeah, we had a great conversation. We ended up using some of the backup questions I had in my presentation, the 3 backup questions I had regarding teaching history, the effect upon students who are white in America. By history, I mean real history. And then how would that affect upon perceptions of societal problems in America? So, it was a good discussion. We talked about, the capacity for people to learn, the necessity for people to learn history, the problem in American education, maybe a few generations back, where teaching history was a very almost scaffolded affair. History teachers could only teach history to certain parameters, those vetted by presumably school boards or schools, or just the sensibilities of the communities that they're teaching in. And as a result, there were lots of gaps, potholes, if you will, in understanding certain aspects of US history, be it regarding Reconstruction, be it regarding learning about the Holocaust, be it regarding learning about the genocide of the indigenous people of the United States. People had to learn, either once they were able to think freely and be taught freely in a liberal university, or relatively liberal university, compared to a fortress of education like the public school systems back then, or through learning on your own, either reading a history book like Howard Zinn's History of the United States, or even Facebook memes, where people are talking about things that have to do with Black history, and different movements and permutations of civil rights activism, like Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party. Different things we also discussed were some of the, we can say, visceral reactions, the visceral effects of being exposed to history that is not subsumed in the myth or religion of, American exceptionalism, and how this creates one of 2 strains of reaction, one being guilt and the fear of that guilt either going to the next generation of students, a certain palpable sense of guilt that, something is necessarily your fault and thus you deserve to make amends. And also fear in learning about this history and having this history presented to students. So these things can actually create a sort of kind of cloistering effect. And this is something that I think, we really need to understand. It's something that lots of people might be going through. And also, we need to understand a way to approach the topic in a way that does not activate these red alerts, that is fear and guilt. So we need to find a way to approach history and put out real history and artifacts of real history that can be disseminated across different schools. And then, we also were discussing things like access to economic aid and power, and how we often talk about racism and structural racism as impediments to just mobility in America. Whether you're going to the store, somebody says something bad to you, but really the crux of racism is the maintenance of a certain kind of pecking order, where certain groups of people are allowed access to economic strength and social strength, and others are denied that and left deprived, if you will, or disenfranchised, if we're talking about rights. And then we discussed, I couldn't write down everything. I tried to write down as much as I could. I'm sorry if I didn't get everything, guys, but I really did try to get the gist of it distilled to this. So I thank you, everybody.
I think we got the essence very well there. Thank you very much, Antar. And Gina?
And one last thing, I forgot, that's right. Elaine mentioned class struggle. She mentioned the differences in socioeconomic parity, socioeconomic strength can affect large swaths of people. So of course, if you have a school that does not have good social and infrastructural funding, it will not have the means to dispense history in a way that can have the truly positive effect of educating people. All students will be deprived across the board, both Black and white. So this is also an element of class struggle and socioeconomic deprivation. That is something that I needed to mention. And thank you, Elaine. I believe that was the last puzzle piece missing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Gina.
Yeah, thank you. I have a slide I want to show the group too before we leave today, Jazz. Our group had some really good conversations, and what surfaced right away was the idea that these questions don't really relate to me being an expat. Like there's not, they're not having that experience of what these questions look like being an expat. But I did have a little pushback being me saying, is there no racism where you are? Right? Does racism not exist? Are there no structural racism in the spaces that you are, which really we know it's all over the world, but the experience being different here in the United States. And there are also conversations around how does everyone really dig into this work on an individual basis, and what comes up, and understanding and knowing what it feels like, and how to recognize that some of the things that we might be doing might be problematic. I did not write down notes, you all, so if there's anything that you want to add in, please feel free. And but really coming back to the idea that and this was something that I said in the group, that, if you have a list of 26 things like the questions that you all answered for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and students of color, that becomes those are compounded issues, right? We're not just experiencing one on that list. We may be experiencing anywhere from 12 to 26 in a day of those things happening, that we're so that the challenge, the hurt, all of the pieces of experience are kind of challenging. So that's what we had. And Jazz, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okie dokie. Thank you very much, Gina. Well, actually, a lot of the things that were said were also discussed in our group, and I'm going to cut it a bit short because we are really running out of time. we talked about one of the same questions that Sharon already highlighted there with the time that's being late, and that there's like this, you're running on Black people's time, and that some people make fun about that and some don't. And then, hello.
Hello.
Say hi. Good.
Hello.
And that some people are making fun of that, and some people don't. That these small microaggressions or micro-racist aggressions actually can really hurt. But to cut a longer story very short, what we actually discussed was that yes, a lot of these questions do feel different or need to be responded differently in a broad kind of aspect, because when you're living somewhere else, you then experience other things and you have a different surrounding there as well. And that it also does just come down to education and bringing out the facts. And also that, yes, it needs to be there needs to be discomfort for change. And that the communication, this is something the four of us had previously talked about, needs to be brought back to life. Things that are said are needing to be said in a way that people A, understand them, B, have the facts and figures in them, and the people listening need to relearn again that to acknowledge what has just been mentioned. So that is just an overview of what we just discussed here. Thank you for hosting those breakout rooms. Do we have any further questions? I know, Bruce, you're still in the queue. Why don't you go first?
Okay, I'm trying to keep it quick here. I just wanted to say again, I really appreciate Gina and Sharon and Antar for giving the background on what the thought behind all this is and what the reality is. And I think that's really important. But I was also thinking on the other end of the spectrum, on the very retail end, I heard my Congresswoman Jackie Spire not long ago say on an interview that, you know, Democrats have super popular policies, but the Republicans are just better at messaging, unfortunately. And she says, you know, they're good at coming up with common phrases and then being really disciplined across all their platforms and using it, whereas the Democrats often come across like textbooks. And ever since then, I've had a fantasy of a Democratic senator going on Meet the Press and Chuck Todd saying something like, asking them, well, you know, the problem being that the Republicans do have this big background, and all across Fox News, everything they've been talking about critical race theory. So in their minds, they know that's bad stuff. So when the Republican politicians just need to say critical race theory, and their supporters hear, oh, you know, mean liberals, scary stuff. So I just have this fantasy of Chuck Todd asking, say, Sheldon Whitehouse or somebody on Meet the Press, Senator, the Republicans say that critical race theory is meaning that third graders are being taught that they should hate themselves because they're white. What do you think about that? And rather than, you know, coming back and saying, well, you know, I think we have to be sensitive to considerations and blah, 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 that the response would be something like, look, Chuck, what the Republicans are saying about critical race theory in the schools, it's a sleazy lie. And if you or anybody on your staff had done the minimal amount of research, you would know that. Are you a journalist or what? And the effect of that would be that, one, you get in the 15 or 30 seconds that you have, you get across the message, and then, you know, next day on Morning Joe, they would all be talking about, oh, Senator Whitehouse was so rude to poor old Chuck Todd. I mean, but it is a way of with the media being stuck on their both sides do it kind of thing. It would make it more likely that the Republicans would then get asked, well, you know, the Democrats just say what you're saying is a sleazy falsehood. How do you respond to that? And it gets a different kind of message out there. And so that's my fantasy anyway.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bruce, very, very much. Do we have anybody else who has a question, maybe even for Gina or Sharon or Antar?
Looks like Adrienne raised her hand.
Okay.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Bruce just said, because I mean, that example for me, what I really, because I feel the media is totally complicit in the problems that we're experiencing now, and just, you know, trying to play both sides of it. And you see some pushback, but for me, it's disingenuous for the most part, because, you know, unlike what most of us who live elsewhere in the world, you know, the media is not a corporate entity, even though, you know, the media is biased. I live in the UK, so I find that the media is biased here too. But what I want to say is, overall, this is a question of humanity. So, you know, yes, we know that, you know, the use of critical race theory, it's dog whistle stuff, right? And so what I'd really like to hear the media say as well, you know, or the Democrats say, excuse me, is that, well, we're interested in the mental health and well-being of all of our citizens. And if you are asking, you know, if you're saying that you don't want white children to feel bad about themselves or whatever, because they're being taught the true history of the United States at the expense of Black and brown kids, that's problematic. And I would really like to hear the Democrats come up with something that says, you know, this is a question of humanity that we're dealing with here, right? Instead of, you know, constantly letting us, you know, hang out to dry, you know, to make certain people feel more comfortable. I just think it's not helpful, and it's very harmful, in fact, to Black and brown kids and adults as well, not just kids.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And also, again, thank you, Bruce, for setting up that kind of fantasy world there as well. But going back into that kind of subject of the critical race theory, which maybe Gina, you also could, yeah, my English is somewhere else today, reply on that too, is that critical race theory is also nothing that has to do with the party. It's actually non-partisan as well. And I just want to shortly highlight the next event, which we are in the making at the moment. It's not on our website yet. It'll be on the website very soon. It's on January 6th. The event is called Reunited States, and it's about the documentary made by Ben Rickey. And Reunited States is a feature documentary that profiles people who have dedicated their lives to promoting depolarization and de-escalation of our tensions across this big political divide. I already had the pleasure to watch the movie, and it just came out beginning of 2021, and we will have the documentary available for you to pre-watch the event then as well. So yes, this was really a great session. Thank you all for joining in, for doing the small homework assessment. Again, please feel free to share what you've learned, what you think about it. If you maybe want to do a discussion group around it, just write me an email at blackcaucus@democratsabroad.org. If you need further information on the Together is Better Alliance or on the great work that Gina Harris is doing, and also what Antar is doing with reparations, we are very happy to connect you with all of them. Yes, so again, thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed this session, and we will see you hopefully at our next event very soon. Wishing you all a happy rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great holiday as well.